The wooden platform creaked beneath Helena Brennan's worn boots as her stepbrother Marcus shoved her forward into the blazing Texas sun, his meaty hand gripping her upper arm hard enough to leave bruises that would bloom purple by nightfall. She stumbled but caught herself, refusing to give him the satisfaction of seeing her fall, her jaw set with a defiance that had kept her alive through 3 years of hell since her mother had died, and left her at the mercy of a man who saw her as nothing more than property to be sold when the gambling debts got too high. The year was 1876, and Austin bustled with cattlemen and cowboys fresh off the trail, their pockets heavy with wages and their eyes hungry for entertainment. But Helena had never imagined Marcus would sink this low, not even after he'd sold off every stick of furniture their mother had cherished, not even after he'd gambled away the small ranch that should have been Helena's inheritance. "Gentlemen," Marcus called out, his voice carrying across the crowd that had gathered in the dusty street behind the Silver Dollar Saloon, "I present to you a fine young woman of 20 years, healthy, strong, and trained in all manner of household duties. The bidding starts at $50. Helena's cheeks burned with humiliation as rough men pressed closer, their eyes raking over her like she was a horse at auction. She wore her only decent dress, a faded blue calico that her mother had sewn 5 years ago, and her dark hair hung in a long braid down her back, coming loose in places from where Marcus had dragged her from the boarding house that morning. She wanted to scream, to fight, to run, but Marcus had made his threats clear. If she caused trouble, he'd make sure she ended up in a brothel instead, and at least this way, he'd claimed with twisted logic, she might end up with a husband who'd treat her decent. $60, called out a grizzled prospector, missing half his teeth. 70, countered a saloon owner whose reputation for cruelty toward the women who worked for him was well known throughout Austin. Helena's stomach twisted into knots as the bids climbed higher. She scanned the crowd desperately, looking for any face that might show mercy, any man who might see her as more than merchandise. Most avoided her gaze, uncomfortable with the spectacle but not willing to intervene. A few looked at her with undisguised lust that made her skin crawl. This couldn't be happening. This couldn't be real. 3 months ago, she'd been teaching children to read in the small schoolhouse on the edge of town. 2 months ago, Marcus had lost everything in a poker game in San Antonio and dragged her back to Austin in a fury, blaming her for his misfortune, claiming she'd brought bad luck to the family. $80, someone shouted from the back. Marcus grinned, counting his fortune before he'd even collected it. Helena's hands trembled at her sides. She'd heard stories of women sold like this on the frontier, but she'd never thought it would happen to her, not in a growing city like Austin where law and order were supposed to matter, where decent people were supposed to look out for one another. $100. The new voice cut through the chaos like a knife, deep and steady and surprisingly calm given the circumstances. The crowd parted slightly, and Helena saw him for the first time. He was tall, well over 6 feet, with broad shoulders that stretched his dusty trail coat and dark hair that curled slightly at his collar beneath his worn Stetson. His face was weathered from years under the sun, strong-featured and handsome in a rugged way, with a jaw shadowed by a few days' worth of stubble. But it was his eyes that caught her attention, gray-blue like a winter sky, and when they met hers, she saw something unexpected. Not lust, not cruelty, something closer to anger mixed with something she couldn't quite name. 100, Marcus repeated eagerly. Do I hear 110? The saloon owner scowled but shook his head. $100 was more than most men made in 3 months of hard labor. The prospector spat in the dust and wandered off. The crowd murmured, waiting to see if anyone would top the stranger's bid. 100 going once, Marcus called out. Going twice. Helena stared at the tall cowboy, trying to read his intentions in his weathered face. He stood with his thumbs hooked in his belt, his expression unreadable now, giving nothing away. He wore a Colt revolver on his hip, the handle worn smooth from use, and his boots were scuffed from hard miles. Everything about him spoke of a man who'd lived rough and survived it. But there was something in the set of his shoulders that suggested he might be more than just another drifter looking to buy himself a woman. "Sold to the gentleman for $100, Marcus declared triumphantly, slapping his hand against his thigh. "Come collect your purchase, mister." Helena's legs felt weak as the cowboy moved through the crowd toward the platform. Up close, he was even more imposing, standing a full head taller than Marcus despite her stepbrother's considerable size. He counted out 5 $20 gold pieces from a leather pouch and dropped them into Marcus's waiting palm without a word, his expression hard as granite. "She's all yours," Marcus said cheerfully, already imagining how quickly he could turn this windfall into a winning hand. "I'll draw up papers transferring ownership if you need them legal." "That won't be necessary," the cowboy said, his voice carrying a hint of something dangerous beneath the surface calm. "Get out of my sight before I change my mind about letting you walk away." Marcus's smile faltered at the cold threat in those words, but greed won out over caution. He pocketed the gold quickly and scrambled off the platform, disappearing into the crowd without so much as a backward glance at the stepsister he'd just sold like livestock. Helena stood frozen, watching him go, feeling the last thread of connection to her old life snap and fall away. She had nothing now, no family, no home, no friends who would risk themselves to help her. Just this stranger who'd paid a fortune for her and could do whatever he pleased without consequence. The cowboy turned to her, and she braced herself for whatever came next, lifting her chin in stubborn pride even though her heart hammered against her ribs. If he expected her to go meek and grateful, he'd find out quickly that Helena Brennan wasn't broken yet, no matter how hard the world tried. "What's your name?" he asked. "Helena," she said, her voice stronger than she felt. "Helena Brennan." "I'm Kane Sullivan," he said, touching the brim of his hat in a gesture that seemed absurdly polite given that he'd just purchased her in a public auction. "Can you ride?" The question caught her off guard. "Yes, I grew up on a ranch before my mother married Marcus's father." "Good. We're leaving Austin within the hour." He turned and walked toward the hitching post where 2 horses waited, clearly expecting her to follow. Helena hesitated only a moment before gathering her skirts and hurrying after him. She had no illusions about her situation. He owned her now, at least in the eyes of the law and everyone who'd witnessed the transaction, but something in his manner gave her a sliver of hope that maybe, just maybe, she hadn't ended up with the worst possible outcome. The saloon owner would have worked her to death. The prospector would have dragged her into the wilderness, and God only knew what horrors. At least Kane Sullivan seemed sober, clean, and capable of basic civility. He stopped beside a beautiful roan mare and a larger gray gelding, both well cared for and properly tacked. He untied the mare's reins and handed them to Helena. "She's gentle but responsive. If you can't keep up, tell me and we'll adjust pace." Helena took the reins, confused by this strange courtesy. "Where are we going?" "My ranch. 3 hours northwest of here." He swung up into his saddle with practiced ease, settling his weight and gathering his reins. "I need to collect some supplies first. Can you handle the horses while I go into the general store?" "Yes," she said, mounting the mare with equal competence despite her dress. The familiar feeling of a horse beneath her brought a rush of bittersweet memories, riding across her father's land when she was a girl, before consumption took him and left her mother vulnerable to predators like Marcus. Kane studied her for a moment, something shifting in his expression. "You really can ride. I told you I could. Most people lie when they're desperate." He turned his gelding toward the main street, moving at a walk. Helena followed, hyper-aware of the stares from townsfolk who'd witnessed the auction or heard about it already. Shame heated her face, but she kept her spine straight and her eyes forward, refusing to cower. They stopped outside Muller's general store and Kane dismounted, looping his reins loosely over the hitching rail. "I'll be quick." Helena sat on the mare, watching him disappear into the store. She could run now. He'd left her unsecured, and the mare was fresh enough to carry her out of town before he could mount up and follow. But run where? She had no money, no supplies, and nowhere to go. Marcus would hunt her down if only to spite her, and she'd end up right back here or worse. No, running wasn't an option, not yet. Better to wait and see what Kane Sullivan intended. At least he'd fed and cared for his horses properly, which spoke to a certain character. Men who treated their animals well sometimes extended that decency to people. He emerged 15 minutes later carrying 2 burlap sacks bulging with supplies and a bedroll under one arm. He secured everything to his saddle with efficient movements, then mounted up again. "Ready?" "As I'll ever be," Helena said, and meant it. They rode out of Austin heading northwest, following a well-worn trail that cut through rolling hills covered in scrub brush and live oak. The October sun beat down relentlessly despite the season, and Helena was grateful for the bonnet she'd managed to grab that morning when Marcus had roused her from bed with shouted threats. Neither of them spoke for the first hour. Kane rode with the easy grace of a man who'd spent most of his life in the saddle, his gaze constantly scanning the horizon, alert for trouble. Helena focused on staying in position and not thinking too hard about what waited at the end of this journey. Finally, she couldn't stand the silence anymore. "Why did you do it?" Kane glanced at her, his expression unreadable beneath the shadow of his hat brim. "Do what?" "Buy me. Spend $100 on a woman you'd never met." He was quiet for so long she thought he might not answer. Then he said, "I knew where you'd end up if I didn't. Figured even a stranger deserved better than that." "So you saved me out of the goodness of your heart?" Helena couldn't keep the skepticism from her voice. In her experience, men didn't spend fortunes on altruism. "I saved you because I've got a sister about your age, and I'd hoped someone would do the same for her if she ended up in trouble." Kane's jaw tightened. "She's married to a good man in Colorado, safe and happy. You reminded me of her standing up there trying not to show how scared you were." The unexpected honesty made Helena's throat tight. "What happens when we reach your ranch?" "That's up to you." Kane adjusted his reins, guiding his gelding around a rocky outcrop. "You can stay and work for me. I need help managing the house, cooking, general ranch work. I'll pay fair wages and you'll have your own space. Or if you'd rather, I can stake you enough money to get to another town. Start fresh somewhere Marcus won't find you." Helena stared at him, waiting for the catch. "And if I stay, what do you expect from me?" Kane's gaze met hers directly, his gray-blue eyes steady and clear. "Honest work for honest pay. Nothing more. I'm not looking for a wife or a bedmate or anything else. I need help running a ranch, and you need a safe place to land. Seems like we can help each other out." She wanted to believe him so badly it hurt. Men don't usually think like that. "I'm not most men." He said it without arrogance, just stating a fact. "My mother raised me to respect women, and my father taught me that a man's word is his bond. I'm offering you a fair deal, Helena. Take it or leave it." They rode in silence for another long stretch while Helena turned his words over in her mind, examining them for hidden threats or false promises. But the more she thought about it, the more she realized she didn't have much choice regardless. Even if he was lying, even if he turned out to be just like every other man who'd tried to take advantage of her circumstances, at least she'd be on a ranch instead of in a brothel. At least she'd have some space to figure out her next move. "I'll stay," she said finally. "For now, anyway. See how things work out?" Kane nodded, as if he'd expected nothing less. "Fair enough." The ranch appeared just as the sun began its descent toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the land. It was more substantial than Helena had expected, with a sturdy main house built from limestone and wood, a large barn in good repair, several outbuildings, and extensive corrals containing at least 30 horses. The property stretched across a shallow valley with a creek running through it, providing water and greenery even in the dry season. It was beautiful in a rough, practical way, the kind of place a person could build a real life if given the chance. "You run this place alone?" Helena asked as they approached. I've got 2 hired hands who help with the heavy work and drive cattle when needed. Thomas and Ray. Good men, both of them. They live in the bunkhouse over there. Kane pointed to a smaller structure near the barn. They're out moving stock to the north pasture right now, should be back tomorrow afternoon. They dismounted in front of the barn, and Kane led both horses inside to stalls that were clean and well-maintained. Helena helped unsaddle the mare, falling into familiar rhythms from her childhood. Working with horses had always calmed her, and she found herself relaxing slightly as she rubbed down the mare's sweaty coat with a handful of straw. You weren't lying about knowing your way around a barn, Kane observed, tending to his gelding in the next stall. My father bred horses before he died. Some things you don't forget. Helena gave the mare fresh water and hay, then stepped back into the barn aisle. What now? Now I'll show you the house, and you can get settled in. Kane closed the stall door and gestured toward the main building. You must be hungry. I'm no great cook, but I can manage something edible. The interior of the house surprised her with its cleanliness and order. The main room held a stone fireplace, a sturdy table with 4 chairs, a worn sofa, and several oil lamps already lit against the gathering darkness. A small kitchen area occupied one corner, with a cast iron stove and shelves stocked with basic supplies. 2 doors led off the main room, presumably to bedrooms. That's my room, Kane said, pointing to the door on the left. The other one's yours. It's not much, but there's a real bed and clean sheets. Bathroom's the small building out back, though I've been meaning to add an indoor facility when I have time and funds. Water pump is beside the kitchen door. Helena moved to the right-hand door and pushed it open. The room was small but adequate, with a single bed covered in a faded quilt, a wooden dresser, a chair, and a window looking out toward the creek. It was more privacy than she'd had in 3 years, and the sight of it made her eyes sting with unexpected tears. It's perfect, she said, her voice rough. Thank you. Kane shifted his weight, clearly uncomfortable with her gratitude. I'll get dinner started. Take your time getting settled. Helena sank onto the bed after he left, letting herself shake for a few minutes as the enormity of the day crashed over her. This morning she'd woken in a cramped boarding house room, certain of nothing except that Marcus was angry about something. Now she was miles from Austin on a stranger's ranch, technically his property, but somehow freer than she'd been in years. It didn't make sense. Men like Kane Sullivan didn't exist, not in her experience. There had to be a catch. There had to be something he wasn't telling her. But sitting there in that small, clean room with the last light of day filtering through the window, Helena decided she was too tired to be paranoid. Tomorrow she could worry about Kane's true motives. Tonight she'd accept the gift of safety and a bed to sleep in without Marcus's drunken raging in the next room. She washed her face and hands in the basin on the dresser, finger-combed her tangled hair, and re-braided it, then went out to face whatever came next. Kane stood at the stove frying salt pork and warming beans in a pan. The smell made Helena's stomach growl, reminding her that she hadn't eaten since yesterday. Can I help? She asked. You can slice that bread if you want. Knife's in the drawer there. Kane gestured without looking up from his cooking. They worked in companionable silence, and minutes later sat down to a simple but filling meal. Helena ate slowly, savoring every bite, while Kane wolfed down his food with the single-minded efficiency of a man used to eating in the saddle. Tell me about the ranch, Helena said, wanting to fill the silence with something other than her own anxious thoughts. How long have you been here? Kane leaned back in his chair, cradling a tin cup of coffee. 4 years now. I worked as a trail driver for a decade, saved every penny I could. When this land came available, I bought it and started building something permanent. It's been hard work, but I've built the herd up to about 200 head, and the horse breeding program is starting to turn a profit. No family nearby? My sister in Colorado, like I said, and my parents passed years ago. Father died in the war. Mother followed him 6 months later from grief. His expression darkened with old pain. It's just me out here, which is how I prefer it most days. Helena sipped her own coffee, feeling the strong, bitter taste ground her in the present moment. I'm sorry about your parents. and I'm sorry about what your stepbrother did to you today." Kane met her gaze squarely. "No one deserves that, Helena. I meant what I said earlier. You're free to leave whenever you want. I won't hold you here." "Why would you let me go after spending all that money?" "Because you're not property, no matter what Marcus or the law might say." Kane's voice carried absolute conviction. "That money bought you time and space to figure out what you want to do with your life. Nothing more." Helena felt something crack open in her chest, some hard protective shell she'd built around her heart during the long nightmare years with Marcus. This strange cowboy with his quiet strength and unexpected honor was offering her something she'd thought lost forever: hope. "I'll earn my keep," she said firmly. "I'm a good cook. I can manage a household, and I'm not afraid of hard work. You won't regret giving me this chance." "I don't expect I will," Kane said, and the hint of a smile touched his weathered face, transforming it briefly into something warmer and younger. They finished dinner and cleaned up together, falling into an easy rhythm that surprised them both. Kane showed Helena where everything was stored, explaining his simple systems for managing supplies and organizing the kitchen. She committed it all to memory, determined to prove herself useful immediately. As full darkness settled over the ranch, Kane lit the lamps and then stood awkwardly in the main room, clearly unsure how to end the evening. "I'm usually up before dawn. You don't need to match my schedule, but breakfast around sunrise would be appreciated if you're willing." "I'll be up," Helena promised. "And Kane, thank you for everything." He nodded once, touched the brim of his hat in that old-fashioned gesture, and retreated to his room. Helena stood alone in the flickering lamplight for a moment, then went to her own room and closed the door. She undressed down to her chemise, folded her dress carefully since it was the only one she owned, and slipped between clean sheets that smelled of soap and sunshine. She'd expected to lie awake for hours, her mind spinning through everything that had happened. Instead, she fell asleep almost immediately, exhausted by fear and relief in equal measure, and slept dreamlessly until the first light of dawn crept through her window. True to her word, Helena was up and dressed before sunrise, splashing cold water on her face and braiding her hair back tightly. She found the kitchen supplies easily enough and set about making coffee, frying eggs and bacon, and warming leftover biscuits from the basket she'd found in the pantry. The work felt good, familiar, purposeful. She'd always liked cooking when she wasn't doing it under Marcus's critical eye and constant complaints. Kane emerged from his room just as she finished plating the food, his hair damp from washing and his jaw freshly shaved. He stopped short when he saw the table set with a full breakfast. "You didn't have to do all this," he said. "I said I'd earn my keep." Helena poured coffee into 2 cups and sat down. "Besides, I like cooking when I'm doing it for someone who'll appreciate it." They ate together as the sun rose over the hills, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. Kane told her about the day's work ahead, riding out to check on the cattle in the eastern pasture and inspect fence lines for damage. Helena listened and asked intelligent questions about the ranch operations, surprising him with her knowledge of livestock and land management. "Your father taught you well," Kane observed. "He taught me everything he knew before the consumption took him." Helena's expression grew distant with memory. "He always said a woman should know how to run a ranch as well as any man, in case circumstances required it. My mother never learned, though, which is why she was vulnerable when he died. She married the first man who offered her security, and he turned out to be Marcus's father. And he was no better than Marcus, I'm guessing. He was worse in some ways. At least Marcus is obvious about his cruelty. His father hid it behind smiles and false kindness." Helena pushed her plate away, appetite fading with the memories. "But he died 2 years ago, and then it was just Marcus and me. Mother had already passed by then, and he saw no reason to keep pretending he cared about her stepdaughter." Kane's jaw tightened with anger on her behalf. "You've had a rough time of it. I've survived, that's what matters." Helena stood and began clearing the table. "You should get to your work. I'll handle things here." He left soon after, riding out on his gray gelding with a wave. Helena watched him go from the window, then turned her attention to transforming the house from barely adequate to genuinely comfortable. She spent the morning cleaning thoroughly, sweeping floors and washing windows, organizing the kitchen properly, and airing out rooms that had clearly gone too long without a woman's touch. She found linens in a trunk and changed the bedding in both rooms, hauling the old sheets out to wash in the big tub behind the house. The work was hard and hot, but Helena welcomed it. Physical labor gave her something to focus on besides the surreal reality of her new situation. She was free, or as free as a woman could be in 1876 Texas. Kane had meant what he said about not holding her here. She'd seen it in his eyes, heard it in his voice. That knowledge settled something deep inside her, allowing her to breathe fully for the first time in years. By the time Kane returned at midday for a quick meal, the house gleamed with cleanliness and smelled of fresh bread baking in the oven. He stopped in the doorway and just stared, taking in the transformation. "Helena, you didn't have to do all this in one day," he said, sounding almost overwhelmed. "I wanted to." She pulled the bread from the oven, the crust golden and perfect. "This is a good house, Kane. It deserves to be taken care of properly." Something shifted in his expression, a warmth creeping into those winter sky eyes. "Thank you. It's been a long time since this place felt like a real home." They shared fresh bread with butter and cold roast beef, talking easily about ranch matters and local news. Helena found herself relaxing into conversation with him in a way she hadn't relaxed with anyone in years. Kane had a dry sense of humor that caught her off guard, making her laugh unexpectedly, and he listened when she talked, instead of dismissing her opinions as most men did. The days that followed fell into a comfortable pattern. Helena managed the house and garden, cooked meals, and helped with lighter ranch work when Kane needed an extra pair of hands. Kane worked from dawn to dusk, maintaining fences, tending livestock, and training horses, but always made time to share at least 2 meals a day with her. They talked about everything and nothing, gradually sharing pieces of their pasts and dreams for their futures. When Thomas and Ray returned from moving the cattle, they treated Helena with respectful courtesy after Kane made it crystal clear that any disrespect toward her would result in immediate dismissal. Both men were in their 40s, weathered and quiet, more interested in their work than in gossiping about the boss's new housekeeper. Helena appreciated their discretion and made sure to include them in big dinners on Sundays, earning their loyalty with her excellent cooking. 2 weeks passed, then 3, then a month. Helena found herself thinking less about escape plans and more about how to improve the ranch. She suggested better organization for the barn, a larger vegetable garden for the next spring, ways to streamline the household budget. Kane listened to all her ideas and implemented most of them, crediting her publicly when things worked well. "You've got a head for this," he told her one evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset after a long day's work. "You should have been running your own place, not stuck with a stepbrother who couldn't see your worth." Helena pulled her shawl tighter against the cooling air. "I used to dream about having my own ranch someday, when I was young and naive and thought women could do such things." "Why can't they?" Kane turned to look at her, his expression serious. "You're smart, capable, and you work harder than most men I know. The only thing stopping you is capital and opportunity. And the fact that most people won't sell land to a woman, won't extend credit to a woman, won't take a woman seriously in business." Helena smiled sadly. "But I appreciate the sentiment." "It's not just sentiment, I mean it." Kane leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "You've got what it takes." "Helena, don't let the world convince you otherwise." His faith in her created a warmth in her chest that had nothing to do with the weather. Helena realized with a start that she'd begun to care what Kane Sullivan thought of her, that his good opinion mattered more than it probably should. Somewhere in the past month, he'd stopped being the stranger who'd bought her freedom and had become something more complicated. A friend, certainly, but maybe also something else, something she was afraid to examine too closely. As November arrived and the weather cooled, Helena noticed other changes too. The way Kane's eyes followed her when he thought she wasn't looking. The way he found excuses to work near the house when he Could have delegated tasks to Thomas or Ray. The way he smiled more easily now, the hard edges of his weathered face softening when they talked. She caught herself watching him too, admiring the way he moved with unconscious grace, the strength in his hands when he worked with the horses, the kindness in his voice when he spoke to frightened animals. She was falling for him, Helena realized one morning as she watched him ride out toward the eastern pasture. Somewhere between his initial act of rescue and the countless small kindnesses since, she'd started imagining a future that included Kane Sullivan in ways that went far beyond employer and employee. The realization terrified her. She'd sworn after watching her mother's disastrous second marriage that she'd never give a man that kind of power over her life again. But Kane wasn't like other men. He'd proven that over and over. Still, Helena kept her feelings buried deep, afraid to risk the comfortable life she'd built by hoping for more. Kane had been clear about his expectations, about wanting help with the ranch and nothing else. She wouldn't make things awkward by developing romantic notions he didn't share. Except Kane was having his own internal battle. At night, lying in his bed separated from Helena by a single wall, he thought about her more than was proper. The sound of her laughter, the way she hummed while cooking, the fierce intelligence in her dark eyes when they discussed ranch business, the quiet strength she'd shown in surviving circumstances that would have broken lesser people. He'd told himself he was saving her out of simple decency, but he'd been lying to himself. From the moment he'd seen her on that auction platform, chin lifted in defiance despite her fear, something had clicked into place in his chest like a key in a lock. He'd fallen in love with Helena Brennan, and he had absolutely no idea what to do about it. The problem was complicated by the circumstances of how they'd met. How could he tell her he had feelings for her when he'd literally purchased her at auction? She'd think he'd been lying all along, that he'd bought her for exactly the purposes he'd promised to avoid. She'd feel trapped and obligated, and Kane would rather cut off his own arm than make Helena feel that way. So he suffered in silence, wrestling with emotions he'd never expected to feel, trying to figure out how to proceed without ruining everything. The situation came to a head in late November during an early cold snap that sent temperatures plummeting overnight. Helena woke to frost on her window and rushed out to find Kane already up, worried about the horses in the far pasture who'd need shelter from the wind. "I'll ride out and bring them in," he said, pulling on his heavy coat. "Should only take a few hours." "I'll come with you," Helena said immediately. "You'll need help herding them, and Thomas and Ray aren't due back from Austin until tomorrow." Kane wanted to refuse, to keep her safe and warm in the house, but she was right. Moving 15 horses alone in bad weather would be difficult and dangerous. "Dress warm, it's bitter out there." They rode out together into a gray morning with wind whipping across the hills. The horses had clustered near a stand of trees huddled against the cold. It took careful work to gather them and start them moving toward the barn. And halfway back, the situation deteriorated when a young stallion spooked at something and bolted, taking 3 other horses with him. "I'll get them," Kane shouted over the wind. "You keep the rest moving." He wheeled his gelding and took off after the runaways before Helena could argue. She focused on keeping the remaining horses together and heading in the right direction, using skills she hadn't practiced in years, but that came flooding back like muscle memory. By the time she got them safely into the corrals near the barn, Kane still hadn't returned. Helena waited 10 minutes, then 15, her worry building with each passing moment. Something was wrong. Kane should have been back by now. She saddled a fresh horse and rode back out along his trail, scanning the landscape for any sign of him. She found him a mile out, on foot beside his limping gelding, blood running down the side of his face from a gash on his forehead. He'd clearly taken a fall, and from the way he was holding his left arm against his body, he'd hurt more than just his head. "Kane?" Helena dismounted quickly and ran to him. "What happened?" "Rabbit hole. Horse stepped wrong and went down. I went over his head." He managed a pained smile. "Got the runaways, though. They're headed back toward the barn on their own." You're hurt." Helena pulled out the bandana from her pocket and pressed it against his bleeding forehead. "Can you ride?" "Arm might be broken, but yeah, I can ride." He let her help him onto her horse with his good arm. Then she gathered his gelding's reins and led both horses back to the ranch. Once there, she got Kane into the house and settled on the sofa, then ran to fetch water and clean cloth. The head wound looked worse than it was, bleeding heavily but not too deep. His arm was another matter, already swelling and turning purple. "I need to get the doctor from Austin," Helena said, binding his head wound as gently as possible. "It'll be dark soon, and that cold front is getting worse. The doctor won't come out in this weather, and you're not riding alone after dark." Kane gritted his teeth against the pain. "I've dealt with broken bones before. Just help me splint it, and I'll see the doctor when the weather clears." Helena wanted to argue, but knew he was right. The temperature was still dropping, and ice had started forming on water troughs. Riding to Austin and back would be genuinely dangerous. "Fine, but I'm doing this properly." She found boards in the barn suitable for splinting and carefully immobilized his arm despite his muffled curses. She made him drink whiskey for the pain, then settled him in his bed with extra blankets and instructions not to move unless the house was on fire. "Yes, madam," Kane said, the whiskey already making him drowsy. "Helena? Yes? Thank you for coming after me. Could have been in real trouble out there if you hadn't." "That's what partners do," Helena said, the words slipping out before she could stop it. "Take care of each other." Kane's eyes, already heavy-lidded from exhaustion and pain, focused on her face with surprising clarity. "Partners. I like the sound of that." He fell asleep before she could respond, leaving Helena to sit beside his bed in the lamplight, watching him breathe and confronting the depth of her own fear. When she'd seen him hurt and bleeding, something had crystallized inside her. She loved him. Not gratitude, not simple affection, but real love. The kind that made her chest ache and her hands shake. The kind her parents had shared before death tore them apart. The kind she'd thought she'd never be lucky enough to experience. For 3 days, Helena nursed Kane through fever and pain as his body fought off the effects of the fall. Thomas and Ray returned and took over the heavy ranch work, but Helena refused to leave Kane's side except when absolutely necessary. She changed his bandages, made him drink water and broth, and sat reading aloud to him from the battered collection of books on his shelf when he was awake enough to listen. On the 4th day, his fever broke, and he woke clear-headed for the first time. He found Helena asleep in the chair beside his bed, her head resting on her arms on the mattress, dark circles under her eyes from lack of sleep. "Helena," he said softly, touching her hair with his good hand. She woke immediately, sitting up and checking his forehead for fever. "How do you feel?" "Like I got trampled by a herd of cattle, but better than yesterday." He caught her hand before she could pull away. "You should be resting, not sitting up with me." "I needed to make sure you were all right." Helena's voice was rough with exhaustion and emotion. "You scared me, Kane. When I found you bleeding out there, I thought—" She broke off, unable to finish. "I'm sorry." He squeezed her hand gently. "But I'm all right now. Thanks to you." They sat there in the dim morning light, hands clasped, something unspoken passing between them. Kane saw his own feelings reflected in Helena's dark eyes, and suddenly all his careful reasoning about propriety and circumstances seemed foolish. Life was too short and too unpredictable to waste on fear. "Helena, I need to tell you something, Emperor," he began. "Wait." She pulled her hand away and stood up, wrapping her arms around herself. "Before you say anything, I need to speak first. I know you brought me here out of kindness, that you wanted to help me without expecting anything in return. I know I'm supposed to be your employee, nothing more. But Kane, these past months have been the happiest of my life, and it's because of you. Not just because you saved me, but because of who you are. The way you treat people with respect, the way you work hard but laugh easily, the way you see me as more than just a woman who needs protecting. I've fallen in love with you, and I know I probably shouldn't have, but I can't help it anymore. And if this means I need to leave because I've made things uncomfortable, I'll understand. But I couldn't spend another day lying about what I feel." She said it all in a rush, words tumbling over each other, and then stood there trembling, waiting for his response. Kane stared at her, his heart pounding so hard he could hear it in his ears. "You love me?" "Yes." Helena's chin came up in that familiar gesture of defiance. "I love you, Kane Sullivan. And before you say anything about how I might be confused or grateful or traumatized, let me be clear. I know my own mind. I know what I feel. I love you." A slow smile spread across Kane's face, transforming it from weathered and tired to something radiantly happy. "Well, that's convenient, because I've been in love with you since about the second week you were here, and I've been driving myself crazy trying to figure out how to tell you without making you feel trapped." Helena's eyes widened. "You love me?" "Completely. Hopelessly." Kane tried to sit up and winced at the pain in his arm. "Come here." She moved to the bedside, and he reached up with his good arm to cup the back of her neck, drawing her down until their lips met in a kiss that was gentle at first, tentative, and then deeper, as they both surrendered to the truth of what they felt. Helena's hands came up to frame his face, careful of his healing injuries, and when they finally broke apart, both were breathing hard. "Marry me," Kane said. "I know it's fast, and I know the circumstances of how we met were strange, but I don't care. I love you, Helena. I want to build a life with you, a real partnership where we run this ranch together. Say yes." "Yes," Helena laughed, tears streaming down her face. "Yes, of course, yes. I love you too, so much." They kissed again, sealing the promise. And when Thomas knocked on the door an hour later to check on Kane, he found them still talking and laughing together, planning their future in excited whispers that spoke of joy and hope in equal measure. They were married 3 weeks later in Austin, with Thomas and Ray as witnesses, and half the town turned out to see it. Word had spread about how Kane Sullivan had bought a woman at auction and then courted her properly, winning her heart through decency and patience. Some people whispered that it was scandalous, but most thought it romantic in a rough frontier way, and even those who disapproved couldn't deny that the couple, glowing with happiness as they spoke, their vows clearly loved each other truly. Marcus tried to make trouble at the wedding, showing up drunk and demanding that Kane give back the woman he'd paid for, but the sheriff escorted him out quickly. Helena watched him go without a shred of regret, leaning into Kane's solid warmth and feeling nothing but relief that that chapter of her life was finally, permanently closed. Their wedding night was tender and sweet, both of them nervous but eager, learning each other with gentle hands and whispered endearments. Kane treated Helena like she was precious, something to be cherished, and she responded with a passion that surprised them both. Afterward, wrapped in each other's arms in the big bed in Kane's room that was now their room, they talked late into the night about dreams and plans. "I want to expand the horse breeding program," Helena said, tracing patterns on Kane's chest with her fingertips. "Your stock is good, but we could make it exceptional with the right breeding choices. I've been studying your records, and I have some ideas." Kane smiled into the darkness, loving the way she said "we" and "our" so naturally. "Tell me your ideas, wife." She did, laying out a comprehensive plan that showed she'd been thinking about ranch management for weeks. Kane listened, impressed and delighted by her business acumen, occasionally asking questions or offering his own thoughts. They fell asleep still talking, more partners than ever before, unified in purpose and in love. The first years of their marriage were hard work but deeply satisfying. Helena's horse breeding program proved successful, and the ranch's reputation for quality stock grew throughout Texas. Kane taught her everything he knew about ranching, and she taught him about long-term planning and strategic growth. They built the business together, making decisions jointly, respecting each other's expertise and opinion. In the spring of 1878, Helena discovered she was pregnant. The news filled them both with joy and terror in equal measure, but as her belly swelled through the summer months, Excitement won out over fear. They prepared the small room off their bedroom as a nursery, painting it cheerful yellow and building furniture together in the evenings. Their son was born in October, 2 years almost to the day after that fateful auction in Austin. He came into the world howling with outrage, a big, healthy baby with his father's gray-blue eyes and his mother's dark hair. They named him Henry, after Helena's father, and Kane held his son with shaking hands and tears streaming down his weathered face. "Thank you," he whispered to Helena as she rested exhausted but glowing in their bed. "Thank you for this, for him, for everything." "Thank you for saving me," Helena said, reaching up to touch his face, "for seeing who I really was when everyone else just saw something to be used." "I saw the woman I was going to love for the rest of my life," Kane said, kissing her forehead gently. "And I was right." Henry was an easy baby, cheerful and curious, and as he grew, he proved to have inherited his mother's intelligence and his father's steady temperament. Helena and Kane settled into the rhythms of parenthood while still running the ranch together, sharing late-night feedings and early morning chores with equal partnership. 2 years later, a daughter arrived, and they named her Sarah after Kane's mother. She was smaller and more delicate than Henry had been, with her mother's dark eyes and her father's smile, and she had both of her parents wrapped around her tiny fingers from the moment she drew breath. Kane proved to be a devoted father to both children, patient and loving, teaching them about horses and ranching as they grew, but also encouraging their education and independent thinking. By 1885, the ranch had grown to over 500 acres with a thriving cattle operation and the most respected horse breeding program in Central Texas. Helena managed the business side while Kane handled the day-to-day ranch operations, and their partnership had become legendary in the region. People came from miles around to buy their horses and to see the couple who'd built something extraordinary together. Helena stood on the porch one evening in June, watching Kane play with Henry and Sarah in the yard. Henry, now almost 7, was practicing his roping skills while Kane called out encouragement and corrections. Sarah, 5 years old and fearless, was attempting to climb onto the back of a patient old mare, insisting she was big enough to ride alone despite her parents' concerns. "Mama, watch me!" Sarah called, and Helena's heart swelled with love so intense it almost hurt. "I'm watching, sweetheart. Be careful." Kane looked up and caught her eye, and the smile he gave her was full of the same love and partnership they'd shared since that first hesitant conversation on the ride from Austin. They'd built something real and lasting, a family and a life that mattered. And every day Helena thanked whatever forces in the universe had put Kane Sullivan in that crowd when Marcus tried to sell her like livestock. That night, after the children were asleep and the ranch was quiet, Helena and Kane sat on their porch as they did most evenings, watching stars emerge in the darkening sky. Kane's arm was around her shoulders, and she leaned into his warmth, perfectly content. "Do you ever think about that day?" Kane asked, "the auction?" "Sometimes," Helena admitted. "But not with pain anymore. Just gratitude that you were there, that you saw me and decided I was worth saving." "You were always worth saving, Helena. You were always worth everything." Kane kissed the top of her head. "But I'm the one who got saved, really. Before you, I was just existing, working myself into an early grave for no real purpose. You gave me a reason to build something that would last. You gave me a family, a real home." "We gave that to each other," Helena corrected gently. "That's what partnership means." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to night sounds and feeling the cool breeze that promised relief from the day's heat. Inside the house, their children slept peacefully, safe and loved, and never doubting their place in the world. The ranch stretched around them, prosperous and well-managed, a testament to what two people could build when they worked together with love and respect. "I love you, Kane Sullivan," Helena said softly. "More every day, if that's even possible." "It's possible," Kane said, tightening his arm around her, "because I feel the same way about you. Every single day, Helena Brennan Sullivan, for the rest of our lives." Years continued to pass in a flow of seasons and celebrations, challenges met and overcome together. Henry grew into a tall young man who shared his father's love of horses and his mother's head for business, already talking about expanding the ranch's operations into new territories. Sarah proved to be a talented artist as well as a skilled writer, filling the house with drawings and paintings of the land she loved. In 1892, when Helena was 36 and Kane 41, they added a final addition to their family, a surprise son they named Marcus, reclaiming the name from Helena's stepbrother and filling it with new meaning. This Marcus would know only love and support, growing up confident and kind, learning from his older siblings and devoted parents what it meant to be part of a family built on mutual respect. Helena's stepbrother, the original Marcus, had died years earlier in a drunken brawl in a San Antonio saloon, and when Helena heard the news, she felt nothing but a distant pity for the life he'd wasted. She'd moved so far beyond that dark period of her life that it felt like it had happened to someone else, some other Helena who'd stood terrified on an auction platform wondering if she'd survive the day. On their 15th wedding anniversary, Kane took Helena back to Austin for a weekend away from the ranch and the children, who were old enough now to help Thomas and Ray manage things for a few days. They stayed in the finest hotel the city offered, dined in restaurants they'd never have dreamed of affording in the early years, and walked through streets that had changed dramatically as Austin grew from a rough frontier town into a proper city. "Do you want to see where it happened?" Kane asked as they strolled through downtown, the place behind the Silver Dollar. Helena considered, then nodded. "Yes, actually, I think I do." They found the spot easily enough, though the Silver Dollar Saloon had been replaced by a respectable dry goods store, and the open space where the auction had taken place was now a small park with benches and trees. Helena stood there looking around, trying to reconcile her memories with the peaceful, present reality. "I was so scared that day," she said quietly, "but also so angry. I kept thinking I didn't deserve what was happening to me, that there had to be some way to fight back and save myself." "And then you did save yourself," Kane said, "by being brave enough to take a chance on a stranger, by working hard and believing in yourself enough to build a new life." "We saved each other," Helena corrected, as she always did. She turned to face him, taking both his hands in hers. "I wouldn't change anything, Kane. Not one single moment, because it all led me to you, to our life together. Even the painful parts made me who I am." Kane pulled her close and kissed her there in the park, not caring who saw them. They were 15 years and miles removed from those desperate people who'd met in such terrible circumstances, but the love that had grown between them remained as strong as ever, deepened by time and tested by life's challenges into something unbreakable. They returned to the ranch renewed and reconnected, ready to face whatever came next together. Their children grew and eventually began families of their own, spreading out across Texas but remaining close-knit and connected. Henry took over primary management of the ranch operations, implementing new techniques and technologies while honoring the foundations his parents had built. Sarah married a lawyer from Austin and divided her time between the city and the ranch, her artwork becoming regionally famous and sought after by collectors. Young Marcus proved to have a gift for training horses and eventually started his own breeding program in partnership with his older brother. Kane and Helena aged together gracefully, their hair graying and faces weathering further, but their love remaining constant. They took joy in their grandchildren, passing on stories and skills to the next generation. They continued working the ranch as long as their bodies allowed, then transitioned into advisory roles, always available when their children needed guidance, but trusting them to make their own decisions. On a warm evening in June of 1910, 34 years after that fateful day in Austin, Helena and Kane sat on their porch as they had thousands of times before. Both were in their 70s now, moving slower but still sharp in mind and spirit. The ranch sprawled around them, now operated primarily by Henry and his family, but still feeling like home. "Do you have any regrets?" Helena asked, the question coming out of comfortable silence. Kane considered carefully, as he always did. I regret not meeting you sooner, not having more years with you, but nothing we did together, no. You? The same, Helena said, reaching for his hand. Their fingers intertwined automatically, the gesture as natural as breathing after all these years. Though I think we got exactly the time we were meant to have. Everything happened the way it needed to. They watched the sun set over the hills they'd ridden across together so many times, painting the sky in brilliant colors that never got old no matter how often they witnessed them. Inside the house, they could hear the cheerful chaos of family, grandchildren playing and their children preparing dinner. Multiple generations united under one roof for the weekly family gathering that had become tradition. I love you, Helena Sullivan, Kane said, as he had said nearly every day for 34 years. Best decision I ever made was bidding on that auction. Best thing that ever happened to me was you seeing past what Marcus tried to make me into and recognizing who I really was, Helena replied, squeezing his hand. I love you too, Kane. Always have, always will. They sat together as darkness fell. Two people who'd found each other against impossible odds and built a love story for the ages. Their story had started with cruelty and desperation, with a woman being sold like property and a man with enough conscience to intervene, but it had grown into something beautiful and lasting, a partnership based on respect and equality, a love that had weathered every storm and emerged stronger. The ranch would continue after them, passing to their children and grandchildren, a legacy built on the foundation of two people who'd refused to let circumstances define them. The horses they'd bred would carry their bloodlines forward for generations, prized throughout Texas and beyond. But more than that, they'd created a family built on love and mutual support, teaching their children and grandchildren by example what a true partnership looked like. As the years passed and eventually Kane and Helena were laid to rest side by side in the small cemetery on the hill overlooking their ranch, their children and grandchildren gathered to celebrate lives well lived and love that had endured. The story of how Kane had bought Helena's freedom and they'd fallen in love became family legend, told and retold to each new generation as an example of courage, compassion, and the transformative power of seeing another person's true worth. The ranch continued to prosper, managed by descendants who carried forward the values of hard work, integrity, and partnership that Helena and Kane had embodied. And on summer evenings when the family gathered, sitting on that same porch watching the same sunsets, they could almost feel the presence of the couple who'd started it all. Two souls who'd found each other in the darkest of circumstances and created light that continued to shine long after they were gone. Their love story had started with a cowboy who bid highest not to possess but to liberate, and a woman brave enough to trust him despite every reason not to. It had grown into something neither could have imagined on that dusty day in Austin, expanding to encompass children and grandchildren, land and livestock, a legacy that would endure for generations. But at its heart, it remained simple and true. Two people who'd chosen each other every day, who'd built a life based on respect and partnership, who'd loved each other completely and without reservation from that first tentative beginning to the very end. And that, their descendants agreed as they passed the story down through the years, was what made it a tale worth telling. Not the dramatic rescue or the unusual circumstances, but the quiet daily choice to love and be loved, to work together toward common goals, to see each other as equals and partners in every sense. Helena and Kane Sullivan had lived that truth every day of their long marriage, and in doing so, they'd created something that transcended their own lives, a love story that would be remembered and celebrated by their family for as long as memory lasted. The ranch still stands today, a testament to what two people built together starting from almost nothing. And on certain summer evenings when the light hits just right, some swear they can still see two figures sitting on the porch, hands intertwined, watching the sunset together as they did for so many years, their love eternal and unbreakable, a beacon of hope proving that even in the darkest circumstances, true love can not only survive but flourish. transforming lives and creating legacies that echo through generations.